The summer of 1998 was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime for the Morrison family. Rick Morrison, a software engineer from Portland, had just bought a brand new Winnebago Brave motorhome. His wife Sarah, their twin daughters Emma and Sophie, both 16, and their youngest son Tyler, just 12, were all packed and ready for a cross-country road trip that would take them from Oregon to the Grand Canyon, then up through Colorado, and back home through Wyoming. 3 weeks of family bonding, national parks, and memories that would last forever. But they never made it home. On August 15, 1998, the Morrison family simply vanished somewhere between Flagstaff, Arizona, and their planned stop in Durango, Colorado. Their RV disappeared without a trace. No crash site, no mechanical breakdown, no distress calls. The family just evaporated into thin air, along with their 30-foot motorhome. For 26 years, their disappearance remained one of the most baffling missing persons cases in the Southwest. Until last month, when a construction crew building a new interstate bypass stumbled upon something buried deep in the New Mexico desert. Something that would crack this case wide open and reveal a truth so disturbing, so carefully hidden, that it would change everything we thought we knew about what happened to the Morrison family. Before we dive into what they found, hit that subscribe button, because this story has more twists than a mountain highway, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The Morrisons weren't just any family taking a summer vacation. Rick Morrison had made his fortune in the early days of personal computing, developing software that would later become standard in most home computers. Sarah was a freelance photographer who specialized in nature and landscape photography. This trip was meant to be a working vacation for her, capturing the beauty of America's national parks for a coffee table book she'd been commissioned to create. The twins, Emma and Sophie, were honor roll students at Lincoln High School in Portland. Emma was the artistic one, always sketching in her notebook, planning to study graphic design in college. Sophie was more technical, following in her father's footsteps with an interest in computer programming. Tyler, their youngest, was obsessed with geology and rock collecting. He'd been looking forward to the trip for months, planning to search for unique mineral specimens at every stop. They were the kind of family that neighbors described as picture perfect. Rick coached Tyler's little league team. Sarah volunteered at the local animal shelter. The twins tutored younger students after school. When they disappeared, the entire community was shaken. The last confirmed sighting of the Morrison family was at a gas station in Flagstaff on the morning of August 14th. Security footage showed Rick filling up the RV while Sarah went inside to buy snacks. The twins were visible in the background, stretching their legs after hours on the road. Tyler was examining rocks in the parking lot, adding a few specimens to his collection bag. They looked happy, normal, like any family on vacation. The gas station attendant, Maria Gonzalez, remembered them clearly. She told police that Sarah had been excited about photographing the sunset at Canyon de Chelly, which was their next planned stop. Rick had asked about road conditions on Highway 160, the route they intended to take into Colorado. Everything seemed routine, but sometime in the next 24 hours, something went terribly wrong. When the Morrisons failed to check into their reserved campground in Durango on August 16th, the campground manager initially wasn't concerned. Families often changed their plans on road trips, arrived late, or decided to extend their stay somewhere else. But when a second day passed with no word, and then a third, he contacted the local authorities. The search began immediately. The Morrisons' route should have taken them north on Highway 160 through the Four Corners region, some of the most desolate and unforgiving terrain in the American Southwest. Search and rescue teams combed every mile of that highway, every side road, every possible detour the family might have taken. They found nothing. Helicopters scanned the desert from above, looking for any sign of the distinctive white and blue Winnebago. Ground teams checked every ravine, every wash, every place the RV might have rolled off the road. The search expanded to include hundreds of square miles of desert, mountain, and canyon country. still nothing. What made the case even more puzzling was the complete lack of evidence. In 1998, cell phone coverage in the remote southwest was spotty at best, so the family's inability to call for help wasn't unusual. But Rick Morrison was an experienced outdoorsman and a cautious driver. He'd planned their route meticulously, left detailed itineraries with friends back home, and carried extensive emergency supplies in the RV. More mysteriously, none of the family's credit cards had been used after that gas station stop in Flagstaff. Rick had withdrawn $500 in cash before the trip, but that money would have been spent quickly on gas, food, and campground fees for a family of 5 traveling in a motorhome. The FBI joined the investigation when it became clear this wasn't a simple case of a family getting lost in the desert. Agent Patricia Hayes, who led the federal investigation, later described the Morrison case as one of the most perplexing disappearances she'd ever encountered. 5 people and a 30-foot RV don't just vanish, Hayes said in a 1999 interview. Even if they'd driven off the road in the most remote location, we should have found something. Debris, tire tracks, some indication of where they went. It was like they drove into a void. The investigation revealed several troubling details that had initially been overlooked. In the weeks before their trip, Rick Morrison had received several phone calls at work that had made him visibly upset. His secretary, Linda Chen, told investigators that Rick had seemed nervous and distracted in the days leading up to the vacation. He kept checking his watch, Chen recalled, and he'd get these calls where he'd close his office door and speak in hushed tones. When I asked if everything was okay, he just said it was family business and not to worry about it. Sarah Morrison's best friend, Janet Walsh, also noticed changes in Sarah's behavior before the trip. Sarah had always been methodical about planning, but this time she seemed almost frantic about their preparations. She kept changing their route, Walsh told police. First, they were going to take Highway 40 through Albuquerque, then she switched it to the northern route through Colorado. Then at the last minute, she changed it back to going through Arizona and New Mexico. It wasn't like her to be so indecisive. Most unsettling of all was what investigators found when they searched the Morrisons' home in Portland. Rick's home office had been cleaned out completely. His computer's hard drive had been wiped, and several filing cabinets that should have contained business records were empty. The investigation hit dead end after dead end. Leads that seemed promising inevitably led nowhere. Psychics, amateur detectives, and conspiracy theorists all offered their theories, but none produced any concrete evidence. As the months turned to years, the Morrison case gradually faded from the headlines. The family was declared legally dead in 2005, 7 years after their disappearance. Their estate was settled, their house sold, their belongings distributed to relatives. But Agent Hayes never forgot the case. Even after retiring from the FBI in 2010, she continued to receive occasional tips and leads about the Morrison family. None panned out, but she never stopped believing that somewhere out there, answers were waiting to be found. Those answers finally came on October 3rd, 2024, in the most unexpected way possible. A construction crew working on a new interstate bypass near Shiprock, New Mexico, was using ground-penetrating radar to survey the area for potential archaeological sites before beginning excavation. The radar detected a large metallic object buried about 8 feet underground in what appeared to be a natural depression. Initially, the crew assumed it was an old mining artifact, or perhaps a piece of farm equipment that had been abandoned and gradually covered by decades of wind-blown sand and sediment. The area had seen mining activity in the early 1900s, and forgotten pieces of industrial equipment were occasionally uncovered during construction projects. But when they began excavating, what they found sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the Southwest. It was a motorhome, a white and blue 1998 Winnebago Brave, buried nose down in the desert sand like it had been deliberately hidden. The license plate, though corroded, was still partially readable. Oregon plates matching the registration for Rick Morrison's RV. After 26 years, The Morrison family's motorhome had finally been found. But the questions surrounding their disappearance were about to get much more complicated. The excavation of the buried RV took 3 days. Every shovel full of sand and sediment had to be carefully removed and sifted through by forensic specialists. The New Mexico State Police had cordoned off the entire area, treating it as both an archaeological dig and a potential crime scene. When they finally managed to clear enough dirt to access the RV's door, Detective Marcus Webb from the New Mexico State Police was the first person to step inside the Morrison family's motorhome in over 2 decades. What he found defied every theory investigators had developed about the family's disappearance. The RV's interior was in remarkable condition, preserved by the dry desert air and protected from the elements by its sandy tomb. But it wasn't what Webb expected to find in a vehicle that had supposedly crashed or broken down in the middle of nowhere. The motorhome had been methodically emptied. All personal belongings were gone. No clothes, no luggage, no camping equipment. Even the food had been removed from the refrigerator and cabinets. It was as if someone had carefully cleaned out the entire vehicle before burying it. But most disturbing of all was what investigators found in the RV's built-in GPS system. In 1998, GPS navigation was still relatively new technology, especially in recreational vehicles. Rick Morrison's Winnebago was one of the first consumer RVs to come equipped with an integrated GPS system, a top-of-the-line Garmin unit that recorded not just current location, but stored a complete log of everywhere the vehicle had traveled. When forensic technicians managed to extract the GPS unit and recover its data logs, they uncovered a travel pattern that made no sense whatsoever. According to the GPS records, the Morrison family hadn't disappeared on August 15, 1998. They had continued driving for another 6 days, crisscrossing the southwest in a pattern that seemed almost random. The logs showed the RV had traveled to locations that were never part of their planned itinerary. After leaving Flagstaff on August 14th, the GPS showed the RV heading northeast toward Colorado as expected. But then, somewhere near Farmington, New Mexico, the route changed dramatically. Instead of continuing to their planned campground in Durango, the RV had turned southeast, heading deep into the most remote parts of the New Mexico desert. The GPS logs showed stops at locations that weren't even marked on most maps. Abandoned mining claims, forgotten ghost towns, places where no family would ever take their children on vacation. The RV had spent hours at some of these locations, sometimes overnight, before moving on to the next seemingly random destination. Dr. Jennifer Hawkins, a forensic data analyst brought in to examine the GPS logs, described the travel pattern as highly unusual and inconsistent with normal family vacation behavior. This wasn't random wandering, Dr. Hawkins explained to investigators. There's a deliberate pattern here, but it's not one that makes sense for tourists. These stops were chosen for specific reasons, though what those reasons were, we can only speculate. The final GPS entry was logged on August 20th, 1998, at coordinates that placed the RV exactly where it was found buried. But according to the timestamp, the vehicle had remained at those coordinates for another 4 days before the GPS system finally powered down on August 24th. This meant someone had been with the RV for nearly a week after the Morrison family was supposed to have disappeared, and that person had spent 4 days at the burial site, presumably preparing the elaborate grave that had kept the motorhome hidden for over 2 decades. The revelation that the RV hadn't simply crashed or broken down changed everything about the investigation. This wasn't an accident or a case of a family getting lost in the desert. Someone had deliberately taken control of the Morrison family's vacation, forced them to travel to remote locations for unknown purposes, and then gone to extraordinary lengths to hide the evidence. But where were Rick, Sarah, Emma, Sophie, and Tyler Morrison? Agent Patricia Hayes, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, was contacted by New Mexico authorities and asked to consult on the case. When she saw the GPS data, her first reaction was disbelief, followed by a growing sense of dread. In all my years investigating missing persons cases, I've never seen anything like this, Hayes said during a press conference announcing the discovery. The level of planning and organization required to carry out something like this suggests we're dealing with someone who had extensive knowledge of the family's travel plans and the technical expertise to execute a very sophisticated operation. The GPS logs also revealed another chilling detail. At several of the remote stops, the RV had remained stationary for extended periods, sometimes 8 or 10 hours at a time. During these stops, the GPS recorded no movement at all, as if the vehicle had been parked and left unattended. But buried in the GPS data was something even more disturbing. The navigation system had a feature that recorded not just the vehicle's location, but also the speed and direction of travel. When forensic analysts examined this data closely, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. At multiple points during the 6-day journey, the RV had traveled at speeds and taken routes that would have been impossible for someone unfamiliar with the vehicle to navigate safely. The motorhome had been driven through narrow canyon roads and steep mountain passes that required expert knowledge of the RV's dimensions and handling characteristics. This suggested that whoever had taken control of the Morrison family's vacation wasn't just familiar with their travel plans, but was also an experienced RV driver who knew exactly how to handle a 30-foot motorhome in difficult terrain. Detective Webb began developing a theory that the Morrison family had been targeted by someone who had been watching them, studying their habits, and planning their abduction for weeks or even months before they left Portland. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, Webb explained to his team. Someone knew exactly when and where this family would be vulnerable, and they had prepared extensively for what happened next. The investigation now focused on Rick Morrison's business dealings in the months before the family's disappearance. Computer forensic specialists were brought in to examine what remained of Rick's digital footprint, looking for clues about who might have wanted to harm the family or why. What they discovered in archived email servers and backup systems would reveal a secret that Rick Morrison had been desperately trying to hide, a secret that explained those mysterious phone calls, Sarah's nervous behavior, and the meticulous planning that had gone into their final vacation. Rick Morrison hadn't just been a successful software developer. In the months before his family's disappearance, he had stumbled upon something that powerful people wanted to keep buried, something that was worth killing for. The GPS logs were just the beginning. Hidden in the coordinates and timestamps was a coded message that would lead investigators to a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and corporate America. A conspiracy that had claimed the lives of an innocent family simply because they had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. As forensic teams continued to process evidence from the buried RV, they made another discovery that would turn the case upside down once again. Hidden in a secret compartment behind the refrigerator, they found something Rick Morrison had left behind, something that would finally explain why his family had to die. But first, investigators had to decode the message hidden in the GPS coordinates, a message that would lead them to other burial sites, other families, and a network of murder and cover-ups that had been operating in the American Southwest for decades. The Morrison family's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something much larger, much more sinister, and much more dangerous than anyone had imagined. And the people responsible for their deaths were still out there, still covering their tracks, still silencing anyone who got too close to the truth. Detective Webb stared at the GPS printout spread across his desk, knowing that he was looking at more than just travel logs. He was looking at a roadmap to one of the most elaborate murder conspiracies in American history. The question now wasn't what had happened to the Morrison family. The question was how many other families had met the same fate, and whether the people responsible could be brought to justice after more than 2 decades of carefully constructed lies. The coordinates told a story of systematic elimination, of witnesses who had seen too much, and families who had asked the wrong questions. Each GPS waypoint represented another piece of a puzzle that stretched across state lines and involved players at the highest levels of power. As night fell over the New Mexico desert, Detective Webb realized that finding the Morrison family's RV had been the easy part. Now came the hard part, staying alive long enough to expose the truth. The message hidden in the GPS coordinates wasn't immediately obvious. It took Dr. Jennifer Hawkins 3 sleepless nights and countless cups of coffee to crack the pattern. She'd been staring at the data for so long that the numbers had started to blur together. But then something clicked. "Look at this," she told Detective Webb, pointing to her computer screen, where she'd plotted all the GPS waypoints on a digital map. If you ignore the chronological order and instead arrange the coordinates by their numerical sequence, they form a pattern. Webb leaned in closer, squinting at the screen. The seemingly random stops across the New Mexico desert suddenly took on a different meaning when connected in numerical order, rather than the order they'd been visited. "It's a message," Hawkins continued, her voice barely containing her excitement. "Someone used the GPS coordinates to spell out letters. Each stop corresponds to a specific point that, when connected, forms alphanumeric characters. The message, when finally decoded, was brief but chilling. Phoenix Files, Vault 7, they know." Detective Webb felt his stomach drop. Phoenix Files wasn't a term he recognized, but Vault 7 sent alarm bells ringing throughout law enforcement circles. It was rumored to be a government classification level that officially didn't exist, reserved for the most sensitive national security information. "Whoever left this message knew they were going to die," Webb said quietly. This was Rick Morrison's insurance policy. The investigation took on a new urgency. Agent Patricia Hayes was brought back as a full consultant, and a joint task force was formed between the New Mexico State Police, FBI, and U.S. Marshals. The case had escalated from a missing family to a potential national security matter. Hayes assembled a team of investigators she trusted implicitly, people who had worked with her on the most sensitive cases throughout her career. Agent Michael Chen from the FBI's Organized Crime Division, Detective Sarah Blackwood from Phoenix PD's Cold Case Unit, and forensic accountant Robert Martinez, who specialized in tracking money through shell corporations and offshore accounts. "We're not just investigating a murder anymore," Hayes told her team during their first briefing. "We're potentially looking at a systematic elimination of witnesses to something that happened over 25 years ago. Something big enough that people are still willing to kill to keep it secret." The team's first breakthrough came when Martinez began tracing Rick Morrison's financial records in the months before his disappearance. What he found painted a picture of a man who had stumbled onto information that had made him extremely valuable and extremely dangerous. In February 1998, 6 months before the family's disappearance, Rick Morrison had received an unusual consulting contract from a company called Meridian Systems Integration. The contract was worth $250,000 for what was described as legacy system analysis and data recovery. "That's a lot of money for what sounds like routine computer work," Martinez explained to the team. So I dug deeper into Meridian Systems. Turns out it's a shell company registered in Delaware with no physical address and no employees listed anywhere. But Martinez didn't stop there. Following the money trail through a maze of corporate structures, he discovered that Meridian Systems was ultimately owned by a subsidiary of a company called Atlantic Strategic Solutions. And Atlantic Strategic Solutions had very interesting clients. "They're a government contractor," Martinez continued, pulling up files on his laptop. "They specialize in what they call information management and data security for federal agencies. Their client list is classified, but I found references to contracts with the Department of Defense, CIA, and something called the Interagency Security Coordination Office." Agent Chen recognized the name immediately. ISCO coordinates information sharing between intelligence agencies on matters of national security. They handle the really sensitive stuff, the kind of information that could compromise ongoing operations or expose sources and methods. The picture was becoming clearer. Rick Morrison, with his expertise in data recovery and computer systems, had been hired to work on some kind of classified government project. But somehow, in the process of doing that work, he had discovered something he wasn't supposed to see. Detective Blackwood, who had been quietly reviewing the case files, suddenly looked up. "I think I know what Rick Morrison found," she said. "And I think I know why Phoenix Files was part of his message." She opened a thick folder filled with newspaper clippings and police reports dating back to the 1990s. "I've been working cold cases in Phoenix for 15 years, and there's always been this pattern of disappearances that never made sense. Families, couples, individuals, all people who had some connection to technology or government work. They'd vanish completely, usually during what appeared to be routine travel or vacation." Blackwood spread out a map of the Southwest and began marking locations with red pins. "Look at this distribution pattern. All of these disappearances happened along major travel corridors between Phoenix, Albuquerque, Denver, and Las Vegas. All the victims had backgrounds in technology, defense contracting, or computer science, and in every case, there was no trace left behind." The pattern was undeniable. Over a 20-year period, at least 30 families had vanished under circumstances similar to the Morrisons. The disappearances had been spread out enough geographically and temporally that no single law enforcement agency had connected them, but when viewed together, they painted a disturbing picture of systematic elimination. "Someone's been cleaning house," Hayes said grimly, "getting rid of people who knew too much about something that happened decades ago." The breakthrough came when forensic technicians examining the buried RV made another discovery. Hidden inside the secret compartment behind the refrigerator, along with some cash and documents, was a small digital storage device, a zip disk that had somehow survived 26 years buried in the desert. The disk was heavily encrypted, but the FBI's cybercrime unit eventually cracked the password protection. What they found on that disk would rewrite American history and expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. The files on Rick Morrison's hidden disk documented something called Project Desert Shield, a classified operation that had run from 1987 to 1994. But this wasn't the Desert Shield that the public knew about, the military build-up that preceded the Gulf War. This was something else entirely. According to Morrison's files, Project Desert Shield was a domestic surveillance operation that had used advanced computer technology to monitor American citizens who were deemed potential security risks. The operation had been run jointly by the CIA, NSA, and a private contractor called Phoenix Group International. But the surveillance hadn't been limited to monitoring. The files documented a systematic program of elimination that targeted individuals who had discovered evidence of illegal government activities. These people weren't just monitored, they were disappeared. The operation had been shut down officially in 1994 following a congressional investigation, but according to Morrison's evidence, it had continued under different names and different contractors. Phoenix Group International had become Atlantic Strategic Solutions, and the elimination program had evolved from a government operation into something that operated in the shadows, funded by black budget money and carried out by private contractors. Rick Morrison had discovered all of this while working on his consulting contract for Meridian Systems. He'd been hired to recover data from old computer systems, not realizing that he was actually helping to digitize and preserve evidence of decades of government-sanctioned murder. When Morrison realized what he'd uncovered, he'd tried to extract himself from the contract. But it was too late. He'd seen too much, knew too much, and the people running the operation couldn't risk letting him walk away. The GPS message Morrison had left behind wasn't just a cry for help, it was a roadmap to other evidence he'd hidden. The coordinates didn't just spell out Phoenix Files, Vault 7, they know. When properly decoded, they also contained GPS coordinates for 3 other locations across the Southwest, where Morrison had buried copies of the evidence he'd discovered. Detective Webb assembled recovery teams to excavate all 3 sites. What they found confirmed their worst fears and opened up entirely new avenues of investigation. At a location near Sedona, Arizona, they found another buried cache containing detailed financial records showing how the elimination program had been funded through a complex web of government contracts and private investments. The operation had generated millions of dollars in profits for its organizers, while systematically murdering American citizens. Near Durango, Colorado, ironically, the Morrison family's original destination, they uncovered a second cache containing personnel files for operatives who had carried out the eliminations. The files included detailed profiles of assassins, surveillance specialists, and cleanup crews who had made families disappear without a trace. The third cache, found in a remote area of Utah, contained the most disturbing evidence of all, a complete list of targets, hundreds of names, addresses, and detailed profiles of individuals who had been marked for elimination over the past 3 decades. Agent Chen stared at the list in horror. "This isn't just about the Morrison family," he said. "This is genocide. They've been systematically murdering American citizens for 30 years. Many of the names on the target list had already been crossed off, indicating completed eliminations. But there were dozens of names that remained unmarked, suggesting that the operation was still active and that people were still in danger." Even more chilling was the discovery that some of the names on the target list were law enforcement officers and federal agents who had gotten too close to the truth about various disappearances over the years. The conspiracy had been eliminating not just witnesses, but the very investigators who might expose their activities. Hayes realized with growing dread that her own name appeared on the target list, along with the names of several other investigators who had worked on missing persons cases involving the families that had vanished. They hadn't just been investigating murders, they'd been marked for death themselves. "We need protection details for everyone on this task force," Hayes told Webb, "and we need them now. If these people are still active, and if they know we've found Morrison's evidence, then we're all in immediate danger." But protection was only part of the problem. The evidence Morrison had left behind also revealed that the conspiracy had infiltrated law enforcement agencies at every level. There were names of FBI agents, police detectives, prosecutors, and judges who had been either compromised or eliminated over the years. The task force faced a terrifying reality. They couldn't trust anyone outside their immediate team. Any attempt to expand the investigation or bring in additional resources could alert the conspirators and result in the evidence being destroyed or the investigators being eliminated. They were on their own, racing against time to expose a conspiracy that had been operating successfully for decades, with resources and connections that reached into every corner of the American government and law enforcement community. Detective Webb looked at the mountain of evidence they'd uncovered and realized they faced an impossible choice. They could try to work within the system, risking that their investigation would be compromised or shut down by corrupt officials. Or they could go public with what they'd found, knowing that doing so would make them targets for elimination by the same people who had murdered the Morrison family and hundreds of others. As Webb studied Rick Morrison's final message hidden in those GPS coordinates, he understood that Morrison had faced the same impossible choice 26 years ago. Morrison had tried to protect his family by going on the run, by changing their route, by staying mobile and unpredictable. But in the end, it hadn't mattered. The conspiracy had been too well organized, too well funded, and too ruthless to let anyone escape once they'd been marked for elimination. The question now was whether Webb and his team could succeed where Rick Morrison had failed, whether they could expose the truth and bring the killers to justice, or whether they would simply become the next names crossed off the target list. Time was running out, and somewhere in the shadows, the people responsible for decades of systematic murder were already planning their next move. The first sign that the conspiracy was closing in came at 3:17 a.m. when Detective Webb's security system triggered an alert. The motion sensors around his house had detected movement, but when he checked the cameras, there was nothing there. just empty darkness and the faint sound of wind through the trees. Webb had been living on edge since the discovery of the target list. He'd moved his wife and 2 daughters to a safe house in Albuquerque, telling them it was just a precaution while he worked on a sensitive case. But the truth was more terrifying than anything he could explain to his family. His phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Chen. Package delivered to wrong address. Need to relocate immediately. It was their predetermined code phrase. Someone had compromised their investigation. Webb grabbed his go bag and the encrypted hard drives containing copies of Morrison's evidence. He'd prepared for this moment, knowing that eventually the conspiracy would discover their investigation and move to neutralize the threat. But as he stepped out of his back door, a figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, lean, wearing dark clothing, and moving with the practiced silence of a professional. Webb reached for his service weapon, but the figure raised both hands in a gesture of surrender. "Detective Webb," the figure called out in a female voice. "My name is Catherine Reeves. I'm here to help." Webb kept his gun drawn. "How do I know you're not one of them?" The woman stepped into the porch light, revealing a face marked by years of stress and the kind of wariness that came from living in constant fear. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying brown hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. "Because they killed my husband 12 years ago," she said, "and I've been hunting them ever since." Catherine Reeves had been married to Dr. James Reeves, a computer scientist who had worked for the Department of Defense in the early 2000s. James had discovered evidence of the continuing elimination program while conducting a security audit of classified computer systems. James found financial records showing payments to private contractors for something called asset management, Catherine explained, as they drove through the pre-dawn darkness toward a safe house she maintained outside Santa Fe. When he tried to report it through official channels, he was told to drop the investigation and forget what he'd seen. But James Reeves hadn't been able to forget. He'd continued investigating on his own time, using his security clearance to access classified databases and piece together the scope of the elimination program. He discovered that the operation had evolved since the 1990s, Catherine continued. It was no longer just about eliminating witnesses to past crimes. They were actively targeting anyone who might pose a future threat to certain government officials and defense contractors. James had been preparing to go public with his evidence when his car had suddenly veered off a mountain road outside Denver. The crash had been ruled an accident, but Catherine knew better. The brake lines had been cut, and James had been murdered to keep him silent. "I've spent the last 12 years gathering evidence and trying to identify everyone involved," Catherine said, as they arrived at her safe house, a modest cabin hidden in the mountains. "I know who runs the operation, how they select targets, and how they carry out the eliminations." Inside the cabin, Catherine showed Webb a wall covered with photographs, documents, and connecting lines that mapped out the conspiracy in stunning detail. At the center of it all was a photograph of a distinguished-looking man in his 70s. "Senator William Hartwell," Catherine said, pointing to the photograph. "He's been running the elimination program since 1987. Initially, it was designed to protect classified operations from exposure, but over the years, it's become his personal tool for eliminating anyone who threatens his political career or business interests." Hartwell had been a rising star in the Senate when he'd first been briefed on Project Desert Shield. He'd seen the potential for using the program's resources to eliminate his own political enemies, and he'd gradually taken control of the operation through a network of loyal subordinates and private contractors. "The beauty of the system," Catherine explained, "is that it operates completely outside official government channels. The funding comes from black budget allocations that are buried so deep in the defense budget that even most senators don't know they exist. The operatives are private contractors with no official connection to the government, and the targets are eliminated in ways that look like accidents or random crimes." The Morrison family had been targeted because Rick Morrison's work on the Meridian Systems contract had given him access to financial records that could have exposed Hartwell's involvement in the conspiracy. Morrison had discovered payments totaling over $50 million that had been diverted from legitimate defense contracts to fund the elimination program. Rick Morrison was actually smarter than most, Catherine said, showing Webb copies of encrypted communications she'd intercepted. He realized what he'd stumbled onto and tried to extract his family from danger, but Hartwell's people were already watching them. The GPS logs from the Morrisons' RV revealed the final, desperate days of a family trying to stay alive. Rick had been following a predetermined escape route he'd mapped out months earlier, moving from one remote location to another, hoping to stay ahead of his pursuers long enough to get his evidence to safety. But they had inside information, Catherine continued. Someone close to Rick Morrison had been feeding information to Hartwell's people, someone who knew about the escape route and could predict where the family would be. Webb studied the photographs on Catherine's wall, focusing on the faces of the conspirators. Do we know who the inside source was? Catherine nodded grimly and pointed to a photograph of a woman with short blonde hair and kind eyes. Dr. Amanda Foster. She was Sarah Morrison's college roommate and closest friend. She worked for the National Security Agency as a communications analyst. Foster had been recruited by the conspiracy years earlier when they'd discovered she had gambling debts that made her vulnerable to blackmail. She'd been providing them with intelligence on potential targets, including her friend, Sarah Morrison. Amanda knew about Rick's work for Meridian Systems because Sarah had mentioned it during one of their regular phone calls, Catherine explained. She also knew about the family's vacation plans, their route, their schedule. She fed all of that information to Hartwell's people. The betrayal had been devastating in its completeness. Foster had even called Sarah the night before they left Portland, suggesting they take the scenic route through New Mexico instead of the more direct path through Colorado. It had been a subtle manipulation that had led the Morrison family directly into the trap that had been waiting for them. Webb felt sick as he realized the level of planning and cold calculation that had gone into the Morrison family's murder. What happened to Foster? She was eliminated 6 months later, Catherine said, made to look like a suicide. Hartwell doesn't leave loose ends. Catherine's evidence revealed that the conspiracy had killed over 300 people over the past 37 years. Families, individuals, law enforcement officers, journalists, and government employees who had gotten too close to the truth about various illegal operations. The Morrison family was just one entry in a ledger of systematic murder, Catherine said. But their case might be the key to bringing down the whole operation, because Rick Morrison was smart enough to document everything and hide it where it could eventually be found. Webb looked at the mountain of evidence Catherine had assembled and realized they faced an enormous challenge. Even with proof of the conspiracy's existence, bringing Senator Hartwell and his associates to justice would require navigating a legal system that had been compromised at multiple levels. We can't trust the FBI, Catherine warned. Hartwell has people inside the Bureau who report directly to him. We can't trust the Justice Department because the Attorney General owes his career to Hartwell's political support. We can't even trust the media because several prominent journalists have been eliminated over the years for getting too close to stories like this. But they did have one advantage. Catherine had been preparing for this moment for 12 years, building a network of trustworthy contacts and allies who could help expose the truth. She'd identified clean agents in various law enforcement agencies, honest journalists who couldn't be bought or intimidated, and government officials who had the integrity to act on evidence regardless of political consequences. There's a federal prosecutor in Denver named Robert Martinez, Catherine said. He's been investigating corruption in defense contracting for years, and he's clean. No connections to Hartwell, no compromising information that could be used against him. Martinez had built his career prosecuting organized crime and public corruption cases. He had a reputation for being incorruptible and had successfully taken on powerful political figures in the past. More importantly, he had the resources and legal authority to act on the evidence they'd uncovered. But getting the evidence to Martinez is going to be the dangerous part, Catherine warned. Hartwell's people know we found Morrison's cache sites. They know we have the evidence. They're going to do everything they can to stop us from going public. As if to emphasize her point, Catherine's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from one of her contacts inside the NSA. The message was brief, but chilling. Wet work team deployed to New Mexico. 3 targets identified. Recommend immediate relocation. Webb felt his blood run cold. A wet work team was intelligence community slang for assassins. Hartwell had decided to eliminate the threat posed by their investigation in the most direct way possible. How much time do we have? Webb asked. Catherine was already moving toward a hidden gun safe. Maybe 6 hours before they track us to this location. We need to move now, but moving meant more than just changing locations. It meant activating a plan Catherine had been developing for over a decade, a carefully orchestrated strategy for exposing the conspiracy while staying alive long enough to see justice done. The plan involved simultaneously releasing the evidence to multiple sources across the country. Martinez in Denver, a clean FBI agent in Los Angeles, a trustworthy journalist in Washington, D.C., and a retired federal judge in Texas who had been investigating government corruption cases for years. We flood the system with so much evidence from so many different directions that they can't stop it all, Catherine explained, as she loaded encrypted hard drives into a specially designed courier bag. Even if they eliminate us, the evidence will still get out. Webb realized he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Once they released Morrison's evidence, he would become a target for elimination himself. His family would be in danger, his career would be over, and his life would never be the same. But as he looked at the photographs of the Morrison family on Catherine's wall, he knew he didn't have a choice. Rick Morrison had tried to protect his family and had died for it. Emma and Sophie Morrison had been 16 years old when they'd been murdered. Tyler Morrison had been just 12. "Let's do it," Webb said quietly. Catherine nodded and began making encrypted phone calls to her network of contacts. The final phase of their investigation was about to begin, and somewhere in Washington, D.C., Senator William Hartwell was about to face the consequences of 37 years of systematic murder. But Hartwell had survived in the shadows for decades by being ruthless and thorough. He wasn't going to give up without a fight, and the battle for justice was about to turn deadly. As Webb and Catherine prepared to leave the safe house, neither of them noticed the small surveillance drone hovering silently in the trees outside, transmitting their location to a kill team that was already racing through the New Mexico night. The conspiracy had found them, and time was running out faster than they'd realized. The surveillance drone's feed crackled to life on multiple screens inside a nondescript office building in Arlington, Virginia. 3 men in expensive suits watched the grainy footage of Webb and Catherine preparing to leave the mountain cabin. "Target acquisition confirmed," said the man in the center, his voice carrying the flat, emotionless tone of someone who had ordered countless deaths over the years. Colonel Marcus Brennan had been running tactical operations for Senator Hartwell since the early days of Project Desert Shield. "Deploy Echo Team to intercept." Brennan turned to the younger man on his left. "How long until Martinez receives the package?" David Sterling, Hartwell's chief of staff, checked his secure tablet. "Our source in the Denver prosecutor's office says Martinez has cleared his schedule for an emergency briefing tomorrow morning. If Webb and the Reeves woman make it out of New Mexico, we have less than 18 hours before this becomes uncontainable." The third man, Dr. Vincent Caldwell, had been the conspiracy's technical specialist for over 20 years. He'd designed the systems that made families disappear without a trace, perfected the methods that turned murders into accidents. Now he faced the possibility that all of his careful work was about to be exposed. "Sir," Caldwell said, his voice tight with concern, "even if we eliminate Webb and Reeves tonight, copies of Morrison's files are already in circulation. My contacts at NSA report that encrypted data packets have been transmitted to at least 6 different locations across the country." Brennan's jaw tightened. Then we implement Protocol 7. Sterling looked up sharply. Protocol 7 hadn't been used since 1994, during the congressional investigation that had supposedly shut down Project Desert Shield. It was the nuclear option, a systematic elimination of everyone who had come into contact with sensitive information, regardless of their level of involvement. Sir, Protocol 7 would require eliminating dozens of people, Sterling said carefully. Federal agents, prosecutors, journalists. The scope would be enormous. The alternative is Senator Hartwell spending the rest of his life in federal prison, Brennan replied coldly, and all of us joining him. Protocol 7 is authorized. Begin implementation immediately. Meanwhile, Webb and Catherine were racing down a winding mountain road in Catherine's modified SUV, its engine straining as they pushed through curves at dangerous speeds. Catherine had installed military-grade communications equipment and defensive systems in the vehicle during her years of preparation. Drone contact lost, Catherine announced, checking her detection systems. But that doesn't mean we're clear. They'll have ground teams converging on our position. Webb was on an encrypted satellite phone, speaking rapidly to his contact at the U.S. Marshals Service. Deputy Marshal Sarah Chen was one of the few federal agents Catherine had identified as completely clean, with no connections to Hartwell's network. Sarah, I need you to listen carefully, Webb said. I'm transmitting GPS coordinates for 3 locations. I need you to get teams to all 3 sites immediately and secure whatever evidence you find there. Lives depend on it. Chen's voice crackled through the secure connection. Marcus, what the hell is going on? I've got reports of unusual federal activity across 4 states. Something big is happening. Bigger than you can imagine, Webb replied. Just get those teams in place. And Sarah, be careful who you trust. This goes all the way to the top. Catherine swerved suddenly as her rear sensors detected movement behind them. In the darkness, she could make out the headlights of at least 2 vehicles approaching fast. We've got company, she announced, reaching for a modified tablet mounted on the dashboard, activating countermeasures. The tablet controlled a series of defensive systems Catherine had installed in the SUV over the years. Smoke dispensers, oil slicks, even a small explosive charge designed to disable pursuing vehicles. She'd learned from the mistakes of people like Rick Morrison, who had tried to run without adequate preparation. But as the pursuing vehicles closed the distance, Catherine realized they were dealing with professionals who had come prepared for her defensive measures. The lead vehicle swerved expertly around her oil slick, its driver clearly experienced in high-speed pursuit. These aren't local contractors, Catherine said grimly. Hartwell sent his A-team. Webb ended his call with Deputy Marshal Chen and grabbed the emergency kit Catherine kept in the back seat. Inside were additional weapons, communication devices, and something that made his blood run cold, a small vial of clear liquid with a biohazard symbol. What is this? Webb asked, holding up the vial. Catherine glanced at it briefly before returning her attention to the road. Insurance policy. If they take us alive, they'll torture us for information about our contacts and evidence locations. That vial ensures they get nothing. The reality of their situation hit Webb with full force. They weren't just investigating a cold case anymore. They were at war with a conspiracy that had been perfecting the art of murder for nearly 4 decades. And like Rick Morrison before him, Webb realized that simply uncovering the truth might not be enough to survive it. The lead pursuit vehicle suddenly accelerated, pulling alongside Catherine's SUV. Through the tinted windows, Webb could see the muzzle flash of automatic weapons. "Get down!" Catherine shouted, yanking the steering wheel hard to the right. The SUV's armored windows spiderwebbed under the impact of high-caliber rounds, but held. Catherine had learned from studying the elimination methods used on previous targets. Most victims had been killed in staged accidents involving their vehicles, so she'd invested heavily in protection and escape capabilities. But as they crested a hill and saw the roadblock ahead, Catherine realized that all her preparation might not be enough. 3 black SUVs were positioned across the highway, their occupants taking cover behind the vehicles with military precision. Nowhere to run. Webb said quietly. Catherine smiled grimly and reached for a red button mounted near the gear shifter. Maybe not, but Rick Morrison taught us something important with his GPS message. Sometimes the only way to win is to make sure the truth survives, even if you don't. She pressed the button, activating a dead man's switch that would automatically transmit their location and status to every contact in her network if they failed to check in within the next hour. If Hartwell's people killed them, it would only accelerate the exposure of the conspiracy. As they approached the roadblock, Catherine made a decision that would have made Rick Morrison proud. Instead of trying to fight or flee, she brought the SUV to a complete stop and turned off the engine. "What are you doing?" Webb asked. "Something they won't expect," Catherine replied, raising her hands in surrender. "We're going to let them capture us." Webb stared at her in disbelief. "That's suicide." "No," Catherine said calmly. "That's strategy. These people have been operating in the shadows for 37 years because they eliminate threats quietly and efficiently. But if they have to take us in broad daylight, if they have to explain our disappearance to other law enforcement agencies, it creates complications they're not prepared for." As heavily armed figures approached their vehicle, Catherine's secure phone buzzed with an incoming message. Deputy Marshal Chen had received Webb's coordinates and was already deploying teams to secure the evidence sites. Even if they didn't survive the next few hours, Morrison's evidence would reach the right people. But Catherine had one more card to play, something she hadn't told Webb about. Hidden in her phone was a live streaming application that had been recording and transmitting their entire conversation to a secure server. If anything happened to them, the recording would be automatically released to news outlets across the country. The conspiracy that had murdered the Morrison family and hundreds of others was about to be exposed, regardless of what happened next. After 26 years, Rick Morrison's desperate gamble was finally about to pay off. Colonel Brennan's voice crackled through the team leader's earpiece as the tactical team surrounded Catherine's SUV. "Take them alive. We need to know who else has seen the evidence." But as the team moved in to make the arrest, none of them noticed the news helicopter approaching from the south, drawn by reports of unusual federal activity in the area. The pilot, veteran journalist Michael Torres from Coat TV in Albuquerque, had been monitoring police frequencies when he'd heard chatter about a high-speed chase involving federal agents. What Torres captured on camera in the next few minutes would change everything. The arrest of Detective Webb and Catherine Reeves, conducted by unmarked federal agents with no apparent jurisdiction or legal authority, would be broadcast live across the Southwest within hours. Senator William Hartwell, watching the live feed from his office in Washington, realized that his carefully constructed conspiracy was beginning to unravel in the most public way possible. After nearly 4 decades of operating in complete secrecy, his elimination program was about to be exposed on the evening news. The Morrison family's long journey toward justice was finally nearing its end, but for the people responsible for their deaths, the reckoning was just beginning. As Webb and Catherine were loaded into separate vehicles, both knew that their capture was actually a victory. They'd succeeded in forcing the conspiracy into the light, where it could no longer operate with impunity. The truth about what happened to Rick, Sarah, Emma, Sophie, and Tyler Morrison was about to be revealed to the world. And somewhere in the New Mexico desert, their buried motorhome stood as a monument to the price of uncovering secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. But the conspiracy had one last desperate move to make, a final attempt to bury the truth that would put even more innocent lives at risk. Senator Hartwell was about to discover that some secrets are too big to stay hidden, no matter how many people die to protect them. The GPS coordinates Rick Morrison had hidden in his family's final journey were about to lead investigators to the biggest government cover-up in American history, and this time, there would be no escape for the people responsible. The live television footage of Detective Webb and Catherine Reeves being arrested by unmarked federal agents created an immediate firestorm across social media and news outlets. Within 3 hours, Morrison family was trending nationwide, and investigative journalists from major networks were scrambling to understand what they were witnessing. But Senator Hartwell wasn't finished. From his secure office in the Hart Senate building, he activated communication channels that hadn't been used since the height of the Cold War. If he was going down, he was taking everyone with him. Initiate Scorched Earth Protocol, Hartwell ordered during an encrypted conference call with his remaining operatives. Every safe house, every cache site, every piece of physical evidence gets destroyed within the next 6 hours. And I want a complete list of everyone who's had access to Morrison's files. Colonel Brennan's voice crackled through the secure connection from New Mexico. Sir, that's going to include federal agents, prosecutors, and journalists across multiple states. The exposure risk is enormous. The exposure risk is already enormous, Hartwell snapped. We're past the point of surgical elimination. This is about damage control now. Dr. Vincent Caldwell, monitoring communications intercepts from his operations center, had disturbing news. Senator, I'm picking up chatter from the FBI field office in Denver. They're mobilizing a joint task force with the U.S. Marshals and DEA. Agent Patricia Hayes is being brought back as a special consultant. Hartwell felt his blood pressure spike. Hayes had been a thorn in his side for decades, always getting too close to operations she should have ignored. Her name had been on elimination lists for years, but she'd always been too high profile, too well connected to eliminate safely. What's Hayes' current location? Hartwell asked. Unknown, Caldwell replied. She went dark 12 hours ago. Her phone's off, her credit cards aren't being used, and she's not at any of her known addresses. What Caldwell didn't know was that Agent Hayes was already 3 steps ahead of them. While Webb and Catherine were being arrested in New Mexico, Hayes had been coordinating with Deputy Marshal Sarah Chen to secure the evidence sites Morrison had identified in his GPS message. The first cache site near Sedona had yielded a treasure trove of financial records that documented decades of illegal funding for the elimination program. The second site in Colorado contained personnel files that identified over 50 operatives who had carried out assassinations across the country. But it was the third site in Utah that contained the evidence that would ultimately bring down the conspiracy. Hidden in a waterproof container, buried beneath a seemingly random pile of rocks, was Rick Morrison's master file. Not just financial records or personnel lists, but actual video recordings of meetings between Senator Hartwell and his key operatives. Morrison had somehow obtained security footage from Hartwell's private offices, recordings that showed the senator personally ordering the elimination of specific targets. Agent Hayes stood in the FBI field office in Salt Lake City, watching the grainy security footage on a large monitor. The timestamp showed the recording had been made in March 1998, just 5 months before the Morrison family's disappearance. We need to eliminate the Morrison contract immediately, Hartwell was saying to Colonel Brennan in the recording. He's seen too much, and his family knows about his work. Clean sweep, make it look like an accident. Brennan's voice was clearly audible. What about the data he's already extracted? He could have made copies. That's why we're using the vacation angle, Hartwell replied. Get them away from their home base, away from their support network. Then eliminate the entire family and destroy their RV. No bodies, no evidence, no questions. Hayes felt sick, watching the cold calculation with which these men had planned the murder of an entire family. But she also felt a sense of vindication. After 26 years, she finally had proof of what she'd always suspected. How do we proceed? Asked Agent Jennifer Walsh, Hayes' hand-picked partner for this operation. Walsh was young, ambitious, and most importantly, had no prior connection to any of the agencies that had been compromised by Hartwell's network. We move fast, and we move smart, Hayes replied. Hartwell knows we have this evidence now. He's going to try to eliminate everyone connected to this investigation before we can make arrests. Hayes was right. At that very moment, assassination teams were being deployed to locations across the country. Deputy Marshal Chen was marked for elimination at her home in Denver. Prosecutor Robert Martinez had a sniper team positioning themselves outside his office building. Even the journalist Michael Torres, who had filmed the arrest in New Mexico, was being targeted for a staged car accident. But Hayes had anticipated this response. During her years of investigating missing persons cases, she'd developed a network of trustworthy contacts throughout law enforcement. People who owed her favors, who respected her integrity, who would act on her word without question. "Activate Phoenix Protocol," Hayes told Walsh, using a code name she'd chosen specifically to mock Hartwell's original operation. "Every person on our protection list gets a security detail within the next 2 hours." Phoenix Protocol was Hayes' own version of a coordinated response. Instead of eliminating threats, it protected them. Instead of operating in the shadows, it brought everything into the light. And instead of serving the interests of corrupt officials, it served the cause of justice. The next 12 hours would determine whether 37 years of systematic murder would finally be exposed, or whether the conspiracy would succeed in burying the truth along with everyone who had discovered it. Meanwhile, in a secure holding facility outside Albuquerque, Detective Webb and Catherine Reeves were being held in separate cells, waiting for interrogation by Colonel Brennan and his team. But they weren't passive prisoners. Catherine had built dead man's switches into every aspect of her operation, and their failure to check in was already triggering responses across the country. Dr. Amanda Sterling, a forensic psychologist Catherine had recruited years earlier, received an encrypted message on her secure phone at 3:47 a.m. The message contained a single word: Phoenix. Sterling immediately activated a protocol she'd hoped she'd never need to use. Within minutes, copies of Morrison's evidence files were being simultaneously uploaded to servers in 12 different countries. Even if Hartwell's people managed to eliminate every witness in the United States, the evidence would survive in locations beyond their reach. At 4:15 a.m., investigative journalist Rebecca Martinez received the same Phoenix message. Martinez had been investigating government corruption for the Washington Post for over 15 years, and she'd been waiting for a story like this her entire career. By sunrise, Martinez had confirmed the authenticity of Morrison's evidence through 3 independent sources. Her editors, initially skeptical of such an explosive story, quickly realized they were looking at potentially the biggest government scandal in American history. The Washington Post's front-page headline on that morning read, "Desert Murders. Secret government program eliminated hundreds of American families over 3 decades." The Morrison family's 26-year journey from victims to vindication was finally complete. Senator William Hartwell was arrested at his Washington office 3 days later, along with Colonel Brennan and dozens of operatives across the country. The conspiracy that had murdered over 300 American citizens was finally exposed, brought down by GPS coordinates hidden in a buried motorhome, and the determination of investigators who refused to let the truth stay buried. Rick Morrison's desperate final gamble had succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined, proving that sometimes the dead can still speak for justice.